everyone. It's my pleasure to be continuing our series today looking at the theme of grace. We've heard over the last few weeks how to be saved by grace, how to be saved by grace, how to enjoy God's grace, what it is to be beloved sons and daughters, having grace to serve, and last week Dave spoke on knowing who we are. The idea of loving, losing the need to pretend and avoiding comparison so that we can be the best versions of ourselves through enjoying the grace of God through Jesus and having a personal relationship with Christ. This morning we're going to be uncovering what it means to have God's grace in weakness, and we'll be looking at 2 Corinthians verse 12, where Paul unpacks this message of boasting in weakness in his letter to the church in Corinth. And I'm just going to pray before we get straight into the passage. Heavenly Father, thank you for being with us here this morning. I thank you that you love us and support us and have the best intentions for us. And I just pray that we see your goodness today. Amen. So, a bit of context before we read the passage. The book which this passage is from, 2 Corinthians, is written by a guy called Paul. And it is a letter to the church in a place called Corinth. Now, Paul started his journey as a Pharisee, a Jewish lawkeeper, and sought to wipe out the early Christians until he was radically saved when he was travelling to a place called Damascus. He has a sudden encounter with Jesus and is blinded for 3 days, and then when he could see again, he decided to spend the rest of his life telling people about Jesus and planting churches. The part of the book 2 Corinthians we're looking at today is where Paul is addressing his conflict with a group of leaders he sarcastically calls the super apostles, who have come promoting themselves and bad-mouthing Paul as a poor leader. And at a risk of coming across as big-headed or boastful, he compares the things they say they are better at than him. They say they are Bible experts, but Paul was a Pharisee and so has memorized the Bible. They say they have knowledge about Jesus, but Paul has actually seen and spent time with Jesus. They ask for money, whereas Paul has never asked them for any. Paul has given his life to the mission of Jesus and explains at length some of the hardships he's been through. To name a few, he's been beaten numerous times, stoned once, received lashings 5 times, shipwrecked 3 times. I mean, you would have thought he'd have understood, not to do that after the first time. He goes on to say he's been in countless amounts of danger in all formats, and also he says he's been cold and without food. It's safe to say he's been through a lot. And then at the start of chapter 12, he shares that he's had visions and revelations of being in the heavenly throne room, and says that he can share these things, not out of boasting, but because they are true. And this is where we pick things up. Paul explains that he isn't boasting about these things that he could be boasting about. So we read from 2 Corinthians 12, verse 6 to 10. Even if I should choose to boast, I would not be a fool, because I'll be speaking the truth. But I refrain, so no one will think more of me than is warranted by what I do or say, all because of these surpassingly great revelations. Therefore, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me, but he said, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong." It's a really interesting passage, and I want to start off by unpacking what this thorn that Paul talks about is, and the reason why he shares this with us in this passage. Now, when I was 21, I was back home playing a 6-side football match with my brother when suddenly I heard this big crack. It felt like my football boot started to collapse and broken underneath my foot, and then when I tried to put my foot down on the ground, I felt this horrendous pain. Turns out I'd actually broken my metatarsal. And the strange thing was that there was next to no pain when I lifted my foot off the ground. But then as soon as I touched the floor, there was this horrendous pain that was almost unbearable. And I'd been looking forward to playing all week, and suddenly I couldn't play anymore, and I wanted to play so much that after it happened, every 5 minutes or so I'd try and stand back up and see if I could walk, to see if I could get back on and play again. But then as soon as my foot touched the ground again, I could just feel the unbearable pain. Unsurprisingly, because I had a broken foot. Now, this thorn that Paul talks about in verse 7, no one is quite sure what it actually was. Whether it was some type of persecution or temptation or a kind of physical or mental pain or one of the other many possibilities it could be, we don't really know. And actually, this very mystery of what the thorn was is actually a blessing to us in the fact that we can all relate to it, rather than if he had identified it, we could quite easily claim that it doesn't relate to us. Paul here is not talking about the bad choices that we make. He is not saying the power of Christ is perfected in my bad choices. Weaknesses are not imperfect behaviours. They are circumstances or situations or experiences or wounds that make us look weak. Things we would probably get rid of if we had the strength to ourselves. Now, what we do know about thorns is that the thorn's effects on Paul were crippling enough for him to have to ask God to take it away. It must have had a big impact on Paul's enjoyment of life and must have distracted his attention and his energy. And so we see he pleads with God to take the thorn away. And I imagine this thorn for Paul would have been similar to how my foot was when I broke it, seemingly fine at times, to the point where I actually think I'm alright and can continue, to the realisation of actually how debilitating it was. And I reckon Paul's thorn must have kept coming back repeatedly again and again, which must have been so frustrating. Now, as I said, we don't know what the thorn was because the Bible doesn't tell us what it was. But we do know something about the thorn. It was irritating. And I think it's really interesting Paul used the word thorn because for me, it makes me think of the word splinter. And anyone who's had a splinter before will know that they are irritating and difficult to get out. And when you have a splinter, you cannot not think about the splinter. And this is why it's a great way for us to understand his struggle with this weakness. But the revelation Paul has about his thorn is that it was necessary. Surely God, who is all-powerful, who can move mountains, take giants down, and separate water, can remove Paul's thorn. That's right. 3 times it says, Paul pleaded with God to remove the thorn, and I wonder if his pleading would have sounded similar to my pleading. God, I will do all these things if only you can take this thorn away from me. God, I will be so on fire for you if you just take this thorn away. I will do anything you say, Lord. I will go anywhere, wherever you lead me. Just please take the thorn away from me. Have you ever asked God something similar? God, if you just help me with this, then I will do that for you. If you give me more confidence, then I would share the good news for you. If you make me more like that person, then I too can do good things for you. It's so easy to try and reason with God so that we can be in a better situation. And Paul would have been in that same place, seeking God to remove the pain the thorn was bringing to his life. Paul pleads with God to take the thorn away because he believes it's his weakness and it holds him back from doing God's work. And it probably held him back from life too. For Paul, though, God didn't take away the thorn, but gracefully shares with him the reason why. He says in verse 9, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. My grace is enough for you, he says. For when you're weak, my power will come through. It's everything Paul needed to hear in order to realise it was necessary, and to understand that his weakness shouldn't be the thing that holds him back, and that actually, in those moments where he feels his weakness, it's that moment God can make us strong. But the problem is, in the text, it says God brought the thorn. But why? What's the purpose of the thorn? We know the thorn couldn't have been sin because God wouldn't give sin. And we know the thorn wasn't random because Paul said God brought the thorn. So what is its purpose? Well, the purpose of the thorn, according to the text, is that the thorn was to bring Paul into weakness. That's why God sent it. And this is in the realm of what the Bible calls God's discipline in our lives. In Hebrews chapter 12, verse 5 to 8, I think it communicates it well what this means. And this is the Message translation. It says, my dear child, don't shrug off God's discipline. Don't be crushed by it either. It's the child he loves that he disciplines. The child he embraces, he also corrects. This trouble you're in isn't punishment, it's training. See, thorns are about training, not torture. Thorns are about purification, not punishment. God's discipline is God's way of training us, and for us to be trained, we have to be in weakness, which is super frustrating because if I'm being honest, I want God to teach me when things are going great. But the problem is when things are going great, I don't always want to listen to God. And so God has to catch us in these weak moments for us to listen. And this is discipline. And so what discipline does and what thorns do is it brings us to our knees. God is bringing us to our knees because it's about humility. The purpose of the thorn is humility. The purpose of the thorn is to get us low. It's to help us see our weakness. Because what pride does is pride gets us thinking that we're strong enough without God. It gets us thinking that we can handle it, that we can do it on our own resources. And so what God does is he permits some pain, he ordains some discipline, and he allows the thorn to squeeze out every single thing that makes us want to trust ourselves instead of God. To keep me from becoming conceited, arrogant, a thorn was given in my flesh. Now, we don't know what Paul's thorn was, but we know he wanted it gone. Praying 3 times to ask God to remove it. The thing about prayer is that it's very easy to have as a last resort. And I think the reason for that is that we don't actually want to talk to God because he might actually tell us something. And so we'd rather not do that, either out of fear or out of pride. Either way, we can easily avoid inviting God into the situation. Paul, though, is like, I've got to talk to God. I want to know his opinion. And God speaks. And we really should be more like Paul because when we speak to God, when we pray, he can provide answers. And so prayer should be the last resort, but it should be the first thing we turn to invite God into our weakness. He may not answer straight away, like we saw with Paul, who turned to God multiple times. But in our patience and in his timing, he will answer. Again, I don't know what Paul's thorn was. I don't know what your thorn is. And you might have many thorns. But from the text, I think we can safely say a thorn is anything in your life you want God to take away. It's the thing we worry about. It's the thing we complain about. And I think it's important to remember that when we talk about those things, it's important to remember that God wants to use us. And Paul would be take away things that's the catalyst for my power through you. Why would I take away the power from strength? Why would I let you out of this weakness? Why would I remove this thorn? And so what he's telling us is the rest in your weakness, for it's then God's power will rest on us. Verse 10 says, for Christ's sake I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I'm weak, then I am strong. And I think very few people want to go to their weaknesses because most people want to stay in their strengths. At most gyms, you will likely see 2 types of people. You will see those who lift weights and go for the bench press, the squat rack, and you'll see those people that want to go into cardio and the treadmill and CrossFit. Very rarely, not always, but very rarely do we see that person lifting heavy weights and that person doing cardio. Very few people want to go to their weaknesses, as most people want to stay in their strengths. And so what Paul was invited to is what we are being invited to, which is, will you respond to the thorn that God has put in your life? The thing you wish God would take away, understanding that God brought it. That doesn't mean it's permanent, but it's here now so that you can be trained, so that we can be humble. It says in Isaiah 55 verse 9, as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts your thoughts. If God is the creator of the heavens and the earth, and his word says his ways are higher than our ways, then surely we can trust in his weaknesses, in our weaknesses. I think ultimately what Paul is saying is that we must trust him when things are difficult. We can't keep persevering in our own strength. We must trust him so that his strength can pull us through. Now, aside from our own battle with pride to keep going in our own strength, we also have to deal with the enemy. Paul touches on this in this passage, and I actually think it's a key issue to discuss. I'm getting nervous now, so I'm about to get really personal. So over the past 6 months or so, my work situation had left me in a position where I had next to nothing to do. Where I had next to nothing to do every day. And to start with, I saw this as a positive thing in terms of having extra flexible time, and I could do more jobs around the house, and I could take my dog out for a longer walk. But soon it really started to affect me, and I started to believe things about myself that weren't true. My confidence in myself started to diminish. My belief in myself suddenly was at an all-time low, and I couldn't shake it. The longer this went on for, the worse it got, and the way I described it, it was like every time someone asked me how I was doing, I would hear this whisper in my ear saying all the negative things I thought about myself. And again, the longer this went on for, it made it harder and harder to believe them, until eventually I just believed them to be true. And for me, this became my thorn, my weakness. It affected all aspects of my life. I found it really difficult to apply for new jobs, as I didn't believe I was good enough. It affected my friendships and my relationships and my interactions with people, as it increased my anxiety, and I believed everyone else saw the same thing. I saw that everyone else saw me the same way I saw myself. And when Paul talks about the thorn was a messenger of Satan to torment him, I really resonated with that. My weakness, my thorn, felt like it was tormenting me, as it just kept coming back again and again. The enemy loves to lie to us and manipulate the truth. The enemy wants to trick us and think our thorns or our weaknesses are the reason we are distant from God, the reason we are lonely or short of confidence. That's Satan's whole scheme, to move us further and further away from God, to push us closer to death than to life. But what God does, and we see it here with Paul, that God uses the hostile intentions of Satan for our holiness. Satan wanted to make Paul miserable and turn him away from his faith and his ministry and the value of the visions he had seen. But God wanted to make Paul humble and to turn him away from his boastfulness. So God appointed the thorn of Satan for the work of salvation. The source of our weaknesses may sometimes be Satan and his destructive intentions for us, but always our weaknesses are designed by God for our good. This is why the truth of God's sovereign grace is so precious in the midst of hardships and difficulties, because God is in control. Satan does nothing to God's children that God does not design with infinite skill and love for our good. The enemy wants us to believe our weaknesses make us unworthy, but Jesus' sacrifice makes us worthy. Jeffrey B. Wilson said, "Christ's grace is sufficient in that it does not banish weakness, but overcomes it by making it the vehicle of his royal power." I'd love to say I turned to God and my struggle suddenly stopped. But as we've seen from Paul in the passage, God didn't remove the thorn. And for me, I still struggle with it. I still feel weak at times. But now I know God's power is resting on me, and I don't have to let it torment me anymore, because God's power makes me strong. Your thorn may be something that is with you for a long time. It may be something that's only with you for a season. Either way, we must trust and turn to God so that we can receive his strength, so that we too can delight in our weaknesses. And I want to finish by saying that it's not wrong to ask God to take away the things in our lives that are difficult, as we see it numerous examples in the Bible of God doing that. God can free us from our pains and our sufferings. However, Paul teaches us that sometimes God allows us to go through weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, or difficulties, so that we may be humble and turn to God and trust that his power will rest on us. And we should get excited to see God in those moments. His power is not made perfect in our strength. His power is made perfect in our weakness. And the reason I'm saying this again is because I bet there is a whole bunch of us who have written ourselves off from God using us in any significant way because of our weakness. And I want to say to you, it's in this place of your weakness that God can use you. Yes, he wants to heal you. Yes, he wants to set you free. But don't wait until you're sorted before letting him use you. Because he wants to use you now. And it's about saying, I may not be very much, but I give you all that I have. I give you all that I am. You don't have to be super spiritual. You don't have to be super holy. You just have to be open to him and say, Lord, I'm getting up again. Can we go another round? I'm trusting in you. And he wants to meet with you there. There's a great verse in Romans 8, verse 35 and 37, where it says, who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall trouble or hardship or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword? No, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. In all things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. The grace of God is not only from the beginning of the Christian life, it's for the beginning, the middle and the end. And with the grace of God, we can be conquerors. As a response, we want to have a space for you to come to God in your weakness and receive God's power. And we're just going to ask God to show up. Stephen's going to come back up and play a final song. And while he's playing, really use this moment to press into God and seek his grace. Come for prayer if you know there is a thorn in your life that you feel is limiting your potential and stopping you from running with God. And I want to really encourage you to come forward for prayer, whether that's during the worship or after the service, as there is so much power in physically making that step forward to meet with God. So while Stephen is leading us in worship, if you want to come forward and receive prayer, some of the response team will come and pray with you. But let me just pray to finish.